Ondansetron is another medication that we're interested in. Ondansetron's actually a widely used medication as an anti-nausea drug. It was actually the drug, interestingly enough, that kind of revolutionized chemotherapy for people with cancer. Before ondansetron, anybody who had chemotherapy could expect to be horrendously nauseous for their entire course of chemotherapy. Ondansetron stopped that for many, many people. With ondansetron treatment, many people can have chemotherapy without getting extremely bad nausea. But it's a relatively old drug now. There are lots of newer agents. But it affects, it stops nausea not by acting in the stomach, but by switching the signals off in the brain. And to do that, it actually acts on a neurochemical, a messenger in the brain called serotonin, which is one of the messengers that are used to, nerve cells used to communicate with one another. And serotonin happens to be one of the pathways in the brain that are putatively involved in schizophrenia. If you take, when people take hallucinogenic drugs like acid, the classic hallucinogenic drugs, they affect serotonin in the brain and they produce psychotic symptoms. And so ondansetron can act through this system. And so it acts through this 5-HT3 antagonist, and we think it may well have some value in reducing the negative symptoms and some of the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia when we add it to one of the other drugs that we commonly use. So we're doing a study now. There are fortunately some groups internationally that have really got on board this idea of trying to fund really sort of cutting edge but different drug development that's not sort of pharmaceutical industry based. And we're fortunate there's a group in the United States called the Stanley Medical Research Institute, which is a philanthropic organisation based, I think, started originally by a family who had a family member with schizophrenia, but were also fairly wealthy, philanthropically minded individuals. And they tend to fund sort of novel ideas, things that other agencies may well not do. And they had already funded a small trial of ondansetron that suggested that it might have some properties. And because they knew that we had the capacity within our centre to do substantial studies of this sort, we were able to get some funding from them last year to start a fairly large study that, if this is successful and it shows effectiveness of this agent, would allow clinicians then to start to use this in clinical practice. So in this particular trial, we're giving ondansetron or a placebo to people who are taking another antipsychotic drug that might have helped their voices or their so-called positive symptoms, but if they're still experiencing problems with motivation or some degree of active symptoms, then this might be a suitable help for them. Keep going, skip through that. And keep going. So I'm going to have a little drink of water, and then I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach now. As well as the other really innovative way we're trying to tackle schizophrenia from a medication perspective is the work of Professor Jayshree Kulkarni, who's the director within our centre, who for a long time has been highly invested in the idea of developing hormonal treatments for schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. We know that estrogen, as well as acting in the reproductive system, there are also receptors in the brain for estrogen and progesterone and the other sex hormones. And by administering appropriate types of hormones, we can actually change brain activity. And that has also yielded some very interesting and promising results as a way of helping people with this illness. Okay, I'm going to move on from that now and talk about some of the other research that we've been doing, which comes at this from a very different tack. This approach says, okay, if we can understand the brain areas and the brain networks involved in illness like schizophrenia or depression or autism, maybe we can intervene more directly by stimulating those areas of the brain, activating them, deactivating them, and we can produce changes in symptoms in that way. And we kind of have a vision or an approach which says that sometime down the track, instead of just having one or two different types of treatments for these disorders, hopefully we'll have a much broader range. And that will give patients choice, it will give a greater range of treatments that might be targeted to different types of interventions. And so that's kind of what's motivated this. Until recently, the sort of biological treatments for these illnesses, and that's not to say that psychosocial treatments are not important, they're extremely important, but that's just not my area of expertise, that until recently, biological treatments have essentially included being ECT and medication. And we kind of think that's not enough. We need a much broader range of treatments, and we need to develop those in a way that's highly targeted and done in a kind of fairly scientific and directed manner. And that some of these will be very non-invasive, very safe treatments that can be done in outpatient settings and so forth. Some of them might be direct replacements for ECT itself. And I won't talk about this today, but we have a treatment called magnetic seizure therapy, which is an alternate treatment for depression that we're trialling at the moment that we see as potentially being a replacement for ECT that doesn't have the same sort of cognitive side effects. Right through potentially to even more invasive treatments for patients where nothing else works. In, say, neurological disorders, you say Parkinson's disease. In someone with Parkinson's disease, if they try all the medication from Parkinson's disease, and eventually they stop working, the most curative treatment or the most effective treatment is then the implantation of what's called deep brain stimulation electrodes that are put into a very small area of the brain that's reversible. You can turn the electrodes off if they don't work, but they can produce a dramatic improvement in someone with Parkinson's disease ability to move and function in their motor way. And so in a number of illnesses, including obsessive compulsive disorder and depression, researchers, including ourselves, have taken a similar approach. And although it's very early days, there's some very promising suggestions that some of these more invasive treatments for the most severe end of the spectrum may have some particular value. And so our approach is to say, well, we need to understand the brain better, so we need to use some of the tools I was talking about before, the imaging, the ability to take pictures of the brain, to understand its function, to build those into developing new treatments. You also use those techniques to kind of refine the way we do the treatment, to make it better. If it works in 20% of patients, let's not give up. Let's make it 30% or 40% or hopefully 80%. And then ultimately develop ways to implement clinical programs. There's no point having these wonderful new treatments if we can't get them out to people and actually provide them where it matters to them.